This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 41 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, October 8th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. The new officers and committees for the recently organized Young People's Society at the Union Congregational Church, which at the time was at the corner of Lincoln Street and Boston Road, now the CPA, under the wise guidance of Mrs. Wallace, are as follows: Otis Day, President; Ethel Richardson, Vice President; Ida M. Trask, Secretary; Pauline Wallace, Treasurer; Social Chairman Hazel Hartford and Sadie McMaster; Prayer Meeting Anna Sims; Music Hazel Hartford and Sadie McMaster and Grace Robinson; Reverend and Mrs. Charles P. Marshall, he was a former pastor of the Union Congregational Church, and daughter Marion have been in town this week as guests at Mrs. Augustus Prescott's, and it has been a pleasure to their many friends here to meet them. Mrs. Delia Wheeler, who has made her home for some time with Mr. and Mrs. John B. Fletcher, has gone to Westminster to act as housekeeper in the household of her brother, who has recently lost his wife. Mr. and Mrs. Emery J. Whitney and Miss Emily F. Fletcher attended the funeral of Miss Mary O. Patton of Littleton last week. Alistair McDougall at the Agricultural College at Amherst has recently been placed in charge of the orchards of Professor Brooks. Quite a large representation from our village enjoyed at various times last week the presentations of The Shepherd King at the Lowell Opera House. Saturday afternoon, a party of 12 went for the matinee. This was probably Il Re Pastori, composed in 1775 by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart at the age of 19. Captain Sherman H. Fletcher's many friends are glad he is able to be about again after being confined to the house for several days with the siege of Pleurisy. The next section is death notice. Mrs. Mary Elizabeth Colburn died at her home late Tuesday evening from Bright's disease, from which she had been a sufferer for a long time. She was born July 31st, 1841, and was the daughter of Amos and Isabella Hildreth Day. At the age of 17, she united with the Union Congregational Church and has always been a regular and faithful attendant when health permitted. Mrs. Colburn sustained an injury to one foot when a child, which caused a lifelong lameness, and she has never enjoyed robust health. 4 years ago, the house and buildings known by older residents as the Amos Day Place was entirely destroyed by fire, and this loss of her lifelong home and its contents was a great sorrow to her. Her marriage to Jonathan Colburn took place in 1873, and he survives her. Also, her two sons, Charles Day Colburn and Jonathan Henry Colburn, and 3 grandchildren, Eleanor, Charles, and Clarence Colburn. The next section is the Tadmonk section. The Tadmonk was the ladies' club in Westford a century ago. The first meeting of the 5th season of the Tadmonk Club met at Library Hall Tuesday afternoon under very pleasant auspices. Miss Loker, who has been the club's only choice for president since its organization, made a pleasing address of welcome. She also brought to the members' consideration the object of the club embodied in the Constitution, quote, to cultivate an interest in literature and in the important questions of the day, political, moral, and social, end quote. Thinking these objects had been very fairly well realized for the progress, pleasure, and profit of the members, and sounding some note of regret that the scope of the club may not have been quite outreaching enough in philanthropic directions, and expressing the hope of some definite effort in this direction. The program for the day was in charge of the president, the subject being roll call. Answered with souvenirs, quote, roll call, answered with souvenirs of travel or historical interest, supplemented with travelers' tales, end quote, and proved delightfully in the working out thereof. Among some of the responses, 2 drawings of old houses with descriptions by Mrs. George T. Day, being the house where she was born, that stood on the present site of Sherman H. Fletcher's home, that was 33 Main Street, and also the house next to the post office. That is the post office at the time was the Wright and Fletcher store at 40 Main Street, and the house is where the so-called Herrick House now stands. That's at 36 Main Street. This was a most interesting contribution of local history in which Mrs. Day is an authority. I might add the original houses and the current houses at these 2 sites are all pictured and discussed in New Old Houses of Westford, revised by Ellen Hardy and Marilyn Day a few years ago. Other objects with suitable descriptions were petrified wood brought from the World's Fair at Chicago, a specimen of the chambered nautilus which comes from the South Sea Islands, old china and pottery, a horseshoe grown into a tree trunk, and many other objects. Mrs. Lambert gave an account of a trip to Marlborough, Mrs. Gould of witnessing the airships at Atlantic City, Miss Lawrence of a delightful trip to the island of Grand Manan in New Brunswick, Canada, and Miss Norris gave a sketch, quote, a day of Old Orchard Conference, end quote, where $60,000 was raised for missions in the single day and 200 people volunteered for missionary service. Mrs. Wallace talked interestingly of the great Aroostook County in Maine, sometimes called the Garden of New England. Mrs. Harrison B. Hall of the Great Boston Fire of 1872, and Miss Emily Fletcher gave reminiscences of a trip to Atlantic City. The next meeting, which will commence at 3 o'clock, Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey will give, quote, reminiscences of old Cambridge, end quote, and Mrs. Charles H. Bonney will bring greetings from the Catabrigia Club of that city, of which she is president. Members are kindly reminded that dues should be paid in October. Next paragraph is called Entertained. Last week, Thursday, Mrs. Oscar R. Spaulding entertained the Thimble Club at her camp at Forge Pond. The weather was ideal and nothing was lacking to make the day one of enjoyment. The dinner table was spread just outside the camp in the clear autumn sunshine. The hostess presented each guest with a pretty view of Prospect Point at Niagara Falls as a souvenir of her recent trip to that place. At the close of the dinner, a picture was taken of the members grouped around the table. Later in the afternoon, a visit was made to the tennis courts and to the camps of other members of the club. An inspection of the cozy bungalow in process of construction for Miss Grace Litchfield and Miss Molly Raines on a knoll near the Good Camp, that's Goode, camp, was especially enjoyed. All were present at this delightful outing but Miss Ruth Fisher and Mrs. George W. Good, who, with her husband, lived at the Good Camp. Well, actually, she lived in the center, but she vacationed at the Good Camp on Forge Pond. The next section is the About Town section. Henry Smith of Graniteville, superintendent for the Abbott Worsted Company, aided the choir of the Unitarian Church last Sunday with his sweet blending tenor voice. I believe he was a member of the Methodist Church at Graniteville and also sang there in the choir. Abiel J. Abbott was hit by an automobile last week, which broke 2 bones in one arm. He is now learning to be left-handed. Typhoid illness at August Nelson's at Mills Corner is still holding its own, and so is the patient. Neither as yet have got an upper hand, but the chances favor the typhoid getting thrown. The largest crop of apples in town is raised by Marshall Brown, whose personality is assessed in Littleton. The town not being large enough to hold so many apples and trees, they are allowed, by paying cost of taxes, to occupy 75 acres in Westford, part of which is rolling hillside prairie, giving over to the dairy. Good judgment estimates his apple crop at 2,000 barrels on the trees. This was prior to the hurricane game of last Saturday, and the large crop promised on the trees is now partly on the ground. At the Republican State Convention on Thursday, William R. Taylor was one of the committee on ballots for Middlesex County. He's the son of Samuel L. Taylor, who writes this section, the About Town section of the Westford Wardsman. Frank Johnson of Depot Environments and Thomas Balch at Westford Center started Monday to see the West. They will commence with seeing Seattle, Washington as a first stop-off. I guess that means they took the train all the way to Seattle and they will work their way back eastward. Cold Spring Road rocks are being deprived of their salt by an application of gravel. James H. Wilkins, candidate for representative to the General Court of Carlisle, will be remembered by Westford people as a brother of Percy Wilkins, a student at Westford Academy who was instantly killed a few years since at Neshoba Railroad crossing by an extra engine running at great speed. Candidate Wilkins is chairman of the Republican Town Committee and master of the Carlisle Grange. The convention will be held at Ayer this Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Miss Amy Schellinger of Somerville has been visiting at the old Oaken Bucket Farm, Stony Brook and Lowell Road. That's the farm of Samuel L. Taylor, and Miss Schellinger mentioned here is actually his brother-in-law, his wife being a sister. His wife is Alta M. Schellinger, a sister Amy Schellinger. The ladies of the First Parish are making preparations for the annual fair to be held sometime in November. The first meeting preliminary to getting right down to labor was held with Mrs. George T. Day Thursday. George R. Harrison, well known in his youthful days in Westford, but now of San Diego, California, is in town after 35 years of absence. For several years, he was engaged in the milk business in San Francisco. Thence to San Diego he went and engaged in the oil and ice business, where he was one of the fire commissioners. He wears a gold medal presented by citizens for faithful services and the invisible badge of a fire company named after him. Mrs. George Howard of Boundbrook, New Jersey, is visiting her father, Samuel L. Taylor, for a few days. Her given name was Martha Jane Taylor, married to George Howard, Jr. The next paragraph is entitled Accident. Notwithstanding the caution and efforts of the selectmen to regulate the speed of automobiles to the safety of the public, as well as of the inhabitants of the automobiles, headlong destructive speed still fills the air with swift, blinding dust. Even this did not prevent a smash-up accident early Monday morning on Depot Street at the Cold Spring Farm. An auto driven by William Merrill of Concord crashed into a two-horse team owned by J. Henry Fletcher of Belmont and driven by Joseph F. Richardson, who was thrown out and badly bruised. Dr. Wells was summoned and soothed conditions. A rear hind leg of one horse was broken. With all his legs, he was valued at $325. The wagon and auto got badly tangled up in this sudden come-together and received many joint compound fractures. The accident occurred on a sharp curve, or rather, the high rate of speed of the auto made it a sharp curve. The Cold Spring Farm was at the hill when you go down Depot Street from the center, and it's at that large curve that makes a right-hand turn where Cold Spring comes into Depot Street. The next section is the Forge Village section. The Manchester Unity, IOOF, will observe the 100th anniversary, that's the Oddfellows, will observe the 100th anniversary of the order with a social dance in Abbott Hall Saturday evening, October 8th. Music will be furnished by Thayer's Orchestra of East Pepperell. All the members are requested to wear their souvenir badges. Mr. and Mrs. Philip Sexton sailed Tuesday on the White Star liner Simbrick for Keighley, England. Mr. and Mrs. Philip Sexton came to this village shortly after their marriage 2 years ago, but failed to settle down. A large number of people came from Keighley in Yorkshire County, or Yorkshire, I should say, in England. Apparently the Sextons came for a little bit and didn't care for it here, so they returned. We don't often hear about people who do that, but it must have happened more than once. Services were conducted in St. Andrew's Mission last Sunday by Reverend A.D. Gring, G-R-I-N-G, a missionary to Japan for many years. His discourse on the life and customs of the people of Japan proved very interesting. Reverend Mr. Gring also spoke before the Sunday school and recited the Lord's Supper in Japanese. Mr. and Mrs. Tenny Martin have purchased what is known as the Old Brick Schoolhouse from Miss Grace Lawrence. This is the house at 35 Pleasant Street. The house is at present occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Cummy Boucher and family. The price paid is $1,000. Miss Mary T. Madden, who has been spending the month of September as the guest of Mr. and Mrs. Hugh Daly, has returned to her home in New York City, where she will take up her duties as a trained nurse. The members of the LSC, that's the Ladies Social Club, met at Recreation Hall Thursday afternoon. After the usual work was disposed of, a dainty luncheon was served. 16 young people of this village journeyed to Lowell on Tuesday evening and enjoyed the performance of Frank Daniels in, quote, The Belle of Brittany, end quote, at the Opera House. The Belle of Brittany was a musical comedy in 2 acts and was first performed at the Queen's Theatre in London in October of 1908. It opened in New York City in 1909, starring Frank Daniels, who died in 1935. The comedy was written by Leadham Bantock and Percy Barrow, with music by Howard Talbot and Marie Horn and lyrics by Percy Greenbank. The village football season will commence on Saturday, when the club will play the Graniteville team on Cameron Grove at 3 o'clock. John Spinner has resigned the position of janitor of Abbott Hall, which he has held for many years. His genial countenance will be greatly missed at the social gatherings where he was well known. John Baker has been appointed janitor to succeed Mr. Spinner and commenced his new duties on Monday evening. At a meeting of the John Edwards Hose Company held Wednesday evening, plans were discussed to hold a social dance in the near future. At the last meeting of the firemen, the resignation of John Carmichael was received. John Spinner Jr. and Matthew Elliott were elected members of the Hose Company. Graniteville is the next section. The first of the Holy Rosary devotions, followed by the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, was held in St. Catherine's Church on Sunday evening and was largely attended. After the services, the men of the parish were invited to remain for a short time, during which Father Doherty impressed upon them the importance of joining the Holy Name Society. The brief remarks were well heeded, and as a result, quite a few names were added to the roll. It is the intention to have the regular meetings held the 4th Sunday of each month at 6:45 p.m., so that all the members will have an opportunity to attend. The high winds that prevailed here on Saturday livened things up some, but no damage was done. At one time, it looked as though we would have a severe thunderstorm, but it luckily passed over and continued down the Merrimack Valley. The stork arrived at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Dudevore on Wednesday morning, bringing with it a little daughter, over which the fond parents are rejoicing. This was the announcement of the birth of Marjorie Bernadette Dudevor, born on October 5th, 1910. Fred Harris of Lowell has been a recent visitor at the home of his mother, Mrs. Alice Harris. Frank Conter and Charles Brooks have been drawn on the jury and are attending daily. Mrs. Annie Decker and her little son John, who have been visiting at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Charlton for the past few months, have returned to their home in Philadelphia, greatly improved in health. The next section is called Football. The sporting element of this village had an opportunity of witnessing a game of soccer football on Saturday afternoon between clubs representing Graniteville and Forge Village. The game is a new thing here, and in spite of the fact that the Graniteville 11 was composed mostly of novices in the association style of play, they won from Forge Village boys by the score of 4-2. The majority of the Forge Village team had played the game across the big pond, and the local players are very much pleased with the fine showing they made against their more experienced opponents. By the big pond, they mean the Atlantic Ocean, and these were probably boys who were born in England and immigrated over with their parents. The game was played in two 45-minute periods and was practically a continuous performance from beginning to end. About the only delay was caused in the first half when one of the timekeepers lost his watch and play was suspended for time being, and a general search made for the timepiece. It was picked up in a few minutes from where it had been dropped on the ground, and play was again returned. Although it proved to be a very interesting game, some of the boys are somewhat lame now due to the strenuous exercise. It is expected that these two clubs will meet again in Forge Village on next Saturday afternoon. A meeting for all those interested in the newly formed club was held here Tuesday evening in the Temperance Hall. That's the news in Westford for the week ending October 8th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.